Hello and good evening all. I hope everyone in applicable jurisdictions had a lovely Thanksgiving and remembered to brine their bird. Today we're taking a slightly more in-depth look at the Lotus that was excellent enough to be banned from Le Mans and actually led the company to boycott the event for more than 30 years, the Lotus 23. Building on the successes and learnings from the 15 and 17, and to a lesser extent the 19, Colin Chapman undertook to design a new car for the 1962 season with the specific purpose of competing in Group 4, back before it turned into a big-budget arms race between Ford and Ferrari in the late 60s. At the time, regulations required Group 4 sports cars to have two seats, or at least space for them, a trunk, a horn, a windshield and windshield wiper, a license plate light, and space for a spare tire, even though most cars built to this rule set were not actually technically road legal in most jurisdictions, so a license plate light in particular is irrelevant. Anyway, to meet these requirements, Mr. Chapman started with their current Formula Junior car, the 22, and modified the space frame chassis, widening it to be nominally capable of accommodating those two seats, and enclosing the wheels within fiberglass body panels. Like many of the earlier Lotus vehicles, the 23 was designed to accommodate multiple engines in the middle of the vehicle, predominantly power plants from Cosworth, ranging from 1 to 1.6 liters, although there were occasionally uses of smaller 750-ish cc Coventry Climax engines known for their piercing exhaust notes. These sent power to the rear wheels through a variety of Hewland 5-speed transaxle gearboxes, although the first prototype reportedly used a Renault 4-speed for some reason. Power output obviously varied depending on the engine used, but was typically in the 75 to 200 horsepower range, which was quite sufficient for a vehicle with a dry weight of a mere 1,000 pounds or 467 kilograms. Interestingly, although not terribly uncommon among contemporaneous race cars, the main frame tubes carried over the 22's function of serving double duty as coolant and oil feed tubes to the radiator and oil coolers, as well as obviously serving as part of the vehicle's structural frame, which, when combined with the relatively small engines, as well as better airflow and a larger radiator versus the 22 on which the 23 was based, meant that the 23 had excellent temperature regulation, especially during longer races. The suspension was double wishbones, but without pushrods, as those had yet to be invented, on all four wheels, with the suspension uprights lifted directly from Triumph's part bin, as was the rack and pinion steering, while braking was provided by discs on all four wheels from our old friends over at Gearling. The debut of the 23 came in May of 1962 at the 1,000 kilometers of the Nürburgring. Two cars were entered, one by privateer Ian Walker Racing, powered by a 1-liter Cosworth engine, and the other by the factory team, running a 1.5-liter Cosworth Mark X, putting out 100 horsepower. The factory team had tapped the master himself, Jim Clark, to pilot the 23 on its debut, and in the rainy conditions, the lightweight Lotus and Clark's peerless driving ability put the car into a class of its own. Despite a robust field, with a number of more powerful cars and talented drivers in attendance, including once and future President Dan Gurney in a Porsche 718, Clark's Lotus absolutely canoodled off from the start, leading Gurney by almost half a minute after the first lap. The 23 led until lap 12 effectively unchallenged, when damage to the exhaust manifold caused Mr. Clark to crash out after the fumes from the engine brought on some wooziness. The other 23 managed to win its class, coming 8th overall and beating such proverbial giants as the Maserati Birdcage, a Ferrari 250 Testarossa, and a Jaguar E-Type. Note that that's a 250 Testarossa, not the heavily side-straked one from 20 years subsequent. With both success and promise for improvement shown in Germany, the obvious next step was the big leap to Le Mans, which, dear God, led to some bizarre rules chicanery. Two cars were entered, one with a 742cc Coventry Climax engine, and the other with a 1-liter Cosworth, with Jim Clark and Trevor Taylor piloting the latter vehicle. I'll try to summarize the back and forth of the rules mess briefly. The 23 is a decidedly low vehicle, topping out a mere 26 inches in height. Doesn't come up much past the knee. I know this photo isn't best for generally depicting the 23, but I'm sticking it in here because I think it's a great side-by-side comparison with a 911, which is by no means a large car, but still looks huge compared to the Lotus. Anyway, The ACO took exception to this petiteness, claiming that the windscreen height was too low, which was the first of its black marks in the scrutineering process. It was similarly done for having insufficient ground clearance, despite the Ferrari P cars entered in the same race having similar ride heights, a fuel tank that was too large, and an overly broad turning circle for all the U-turns that one has to do on Circuit de la Sarthe. The final little niggle came from a disagreement over the spare tire provision, as the 23 ran front and rear wheels of dissimilar widths and bolt patterns, 4 studs on the front and 6 on the rear, with the 23 only carrying a spare for the front that therefore could not be fitted to the rear wheels. The Lotus mechanics and engineers were able to make adjustments to the 2 cars to get them in compliance with the French demands on all points except for the wheels, photo here showing the improvised taller windscreens. After some brainstorming, it was decided to have rear hubs fabricated that would be compatible with the front wheels, that is to say, 4-stud rear hubs. This was done overnight in England, and the new replacement parts were hand-carried to Le Mans the subsequent morning, as they were working a tight time schedule and had to have the cars modified and resubmitted for scrutineering before midday. In typically French fashion, however, the officials decided to move the goalposts on the Lotus team, and when the solution was presented, the scrutineers, in time I might add, the scrutineers decided that the new design was unsafe relative to the old 6-stud design. This snap analysis being made, naturally, by race officials with no training as structural engineers. Protests and attempts to prove the strength of the new design by Lotus's actual structural engineers and designers fell on deaf ears, and the 23s were barred from contesting the race. The fact that the 23s threatened to absolutely dominate the smaller displacement classes that presented the only real opportunities for any French-manufactured entries to earn class victories definitely had nothing to do with the situation. The 2-team Lotus Elites, however, coupe road cars, went 1-2 in class as well as in the index of performance that year, so it wasn't a total washout for the Lotus team, and the ACO, of course, then had to renege on the decision of barring the 23s from competition after the race, saying that they had been wrong to do so, and offering to make good on the expense that the Lotus team had incurred in bringing the cars over. Mr. Chapman listed out the estimated amount they had spent. Monsieur Lelièvre, who was the chairman of the ACO at the time, rejected the figure as being exorbitant, and Chapman excused himself from the meeting with the declaration that his cars would never again race at the Circuit de la Sarthe, an assertion that held true until more than 15 years after his death. One of the 2 cars present at the race was sold immediately ex post facto to Gerard Cronbach on the condition that the Le Mans-specific rear hubs be retained for at least 1 year of competition, presumably to further prove that they were indeed structurally sound. This condition was accepted, and, surprise of surprises, not only did the 4-stud hubs survive the season in good order, but the car brought home class victories at the 6 hours of Clermont-Ferrand and the 1,000 kilometers of Montieri, rather bearing out the solidity of the design despite its last-minute nature. The subsequent year, 1963, the 23 was updated and redesignated the 23B. Notable changes included strengthening the frame to take higher output engines, including the Cosworth Mark XIII, relocating the gear shift to the right side of the car from the center line to improve drivability for those unaccustomed to right-hand drive and therefore left-hand shifting automobiles, the cooling apparati, the cooling gubbins were repackaged into a single combined radiator and oil cooler, and the air intakes were reworked slightly. Performance that year was good, with a number of class and outright wins for the car, depending on the races entered, and another version was produced in subsequent years, the 23C. This was a less significant redesign, largely aimed at improving road holding and grip as the larger engines and subsequent power increases started to overtax the rather skinny tires of the earlier models. The 6-stud rear hubs were updated and spread to the fronts as well, running chunkier tires borrowed from Formula 2 cars, and the bodywork was updated to match. This proved to be a winning combination, even more so than the previous iterations, and the 23 proved popular in its contemporary idiom and remains so to this day. Around 130 were originally built across the 3 variants, and replicas are available as well from a number of manufacturers. Photos from this video are largely my own from Road Atlanta and Sebring Historic, and are primarily of the 23B because that's what shows up at those events. What fun! Perhaps unsurprisingly, there were none running at Le Mans Classic. Incidentally, on the day that this is going out, I am at Sebring Historics for the whole week/weekend, as I've probably posted some shots from already. So if any of you, dear listeners, are also there, let me know. Would be delighted to have a beer. We are down at turn 7. And with that, we come to the end of another slightly longer video. I'm going to take a brief moment to give credit for the Domu Zero video idea, and by that, partial credit for the idea of Oddity Week on the whole to Shady Individual 666. Thank you for reminding me it was your request a couple of weeks ago. And for this week's call to action not featuring the 3 sacred words of YouTube.
Like, comment, subscribe.
This one is indeed a call to action. The Grattan Raceway, not Grattan, mind you, in Michigan has gone up for sale, yet another of the many smaller local or regional tracks scattered across the country, coming under threat from urban sprawl and equally as threatened as a gopher tortoise from habitat loss. While I don't personally have the resources or ability to / interest in moving all the way to the outskirts of Detroit, on the off chance that any of you, dear listeners, happen to be local to that area or similarly well-heeled enough to acquire some non-local property just for the sake of it, it would be a shame to see it get bulldozed over to create a neighborhood or luxury apartment homes that will invariably look dingy and run down in 10 years, or anything of that unfortunate ilk. So go forth and be purchasers, if ye be men of valor, and considerable financial resources. Anyway, as always, thank you for your time this evening, or whenever and wherever you are watching, and I wish you all a good night and a good tomorrow.